everyone. I'm Pete Soderling. I'm the founder of Data Council and the Data Community Fund, and excited to bring you another episode of DC Thursdays, where we chat with leaders of top data companies and open source projects. And today I'm very excited to have Graham Thompson, who's the founder and CEO of Privacy Dynamics. Graham, welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, happy to be here.
Graham has a checkered background. Actually, it's a fascinating background, and we're going to get into that a little bit. But Graham was previously at Microsoft and Apple. He also has a mechanical engineering degree from University of Washington and an MBA from University of San Francisco. Graham, you might not be the most technical person we've had on the show from a software engineering standpoint, but you sure hold your own in a deeply technical field when it comes to starting startups. So I want to chat with you a little bit about that. And yeah, we're really excited to have you here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And, backgrounds are interesting. So many things happen throughout your career that kind of guide you to what you end up doing. But I've been fortunate to have a lot of really cool jobs I look back on and had such a big impact on my ability to kind of execute now.
Yeah, awesome. Well, tell us about the early start of your career and what that looked like, because I'm always fascinated at the variety of different stories we get on the show.
Yeah, well, I mean, it started mechanical engineering, started University of Washington early on. Freshman year, I didn't know what I wanted to do, probably like most students, and knew I really enjoyed math and sciences, but also kind of had this pull towards like economics and business. Really landed on engineering because it was challenging and I found it fun and hands-on. And so I resonated with the ability to learn that path. But as I got into the field of mechanical engineering after college, I realized I was actually not very good at it. I really liked the creative aspects of it, the first 80% of the work, but the last 20, the detail, testing and kind of operational stuff, I just wasn't very passionate about. So I probably wasn't a terribly great employee early on doing kind of the detail work that young engineers often have to do. And so, I always had this pull to kind of use that as a foundation, but be more on the sort of building side. And I really enjoyed the innovation work, which naturally fit into startups and being a founder. And now I get the option of coming up with the problem solve and come up with the solutions, but then lean on our engineering team to really execute on that side of it. So
awesome. And how did you get started in data?
So data really started back in like 2009. I was in business school at University of San Francisco, and I was riding bikes a lot with Keenan Rice from Looker. At the time, it was at Turn, and so we were riding bikes like most mornings before work. And this is like ad tech was fairly new to me at that point. And you could see it building and the amount of data that companies were collecting.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And as I moved, out of business school and getting into tech, data was always a space that I saw as super important and foundational to the future of tech, which obviously it has been now. And those early days with Keenan and getting to know the business, it sort of stuck with me. And so when eventually my wife and I moved back to Seattle, I took a job with Microsoft, that sort of naturally worked in at the same time that they were starting Looker. So I had a front row seat to everything that was going on with Azure and the early days of Azure at Microsoft, but also sort of on the startup side with Looker and what was happening there. So it was just a sort of benefit of being in the right place with the right people around that really got me excited about the potential with data.
Awesome. And then from there, you went to Microsoft. Is that right? That was sort of following these conversations with Keenan?
Yeah. So in 2012, when we moved back to Seattle, and I took a job with Microsoft, the job market was so much different than it is now. And coming out of business school in 2010, the job market was bad. And so I was literally looking for anything at this point. Being a mechanical engineer with an MBA, it's a unique background, and with engineering experience, you know, people weren't hiring you for business roles. And so I found a role at Microsoft called I was a technical evangelist, and their technical evangelists were across the company. So there were really like maybe 10 titles at the company. You know, there's like software engineer, technical evangelist, business development manager, and technical evangelist was sort of in between. It's now often more referred to as like developer relations or developer advocate. But back then it was just all, you know, technical evangelist. And so fortunately for me, when I went in, I joined a team that was led by Daniel Lewin, former like co-founder of Next with Steve Jobs, and like someone that out of the industry had an entrepreneurial mindset, but also within Microsoft, you know, his role was really to find interesting work for the team to go execute on. And it was such a wonderful position. I ended up working for him my whole career there, and he always did a wonderful job of finding us interesting work. And it went from the early days of Azure and the developer relation stuff over into when we started working more on trusted cloud. He started an organization under Brad Smith for Civic Tech. And the idea was really around how do we influence and push forward the policy and some of the work happening in government to make sure that they were innovating at the same pace that the private sector was. And so I found myself in this really interesting intersection of policy and technology and the growth of sort of the migration to the cloud for a lot of the big enterprise customers. So,
and was that specifically privacy related at the time, your interest in your work?
I wasn't told to go work on privacy, but at the time, you know, when we're working with enterprise customers, remember they're all trying to, and these are big, slow-moving enterprises that were trying to move to the cloud, and then Microsoft was trying to sell them on the benefits of ML and AI and some of the compute-related things that they could do on Azure once they got their data there. But a lot of the friction around that was starting to be developed with GDPR and the privacy policy. This was like 2014, 2016. And so what was happening is there was all these concerns about like, okay, yeah, we're going to invest millions of dollars moving to Azure. We're going to start to build out ML teams to take advantage of that data once it's in the cloud. But what happens if tomorrow, you know, new regulation essentially disables our ability to act on any of it? And so it was this big risk that they weren't sure if they could make those investments and actually capitalize on them in the future. And so our job was to sort of do pre-sales and go in and work with those customers to make sure that their policies were secure, and the way that they were actually setting up these workflows would last in a post GDPR world. And that was the point where I really started to hear repeatable concerns from customers around like, we don't know what data is considered sensitive. Like, we don't know when identifiable data is present, and this is, you know, far beyond just the identification of PII in the data set. But like some of the breaches from Netflix and the re-identification attack from the Netflix and IMDb join, those were the things that were actually driving a lot of concern. And people were saying, well, we're not going to do anything. We're actually not going to use that data because there's too much risk from a brand and trust perspective from our customers. And that we just heard that over and over and over again.
And so, and how did this relate to this job of you talk about it as, well, you didn't call it DevRel, but this sort of technical advocacy, like how did these two things collide in terms of what your personal responsibilities were at the company at the time?
Yeah, so the beauty of the position that I was in as a, you know, technical evangelist or doing sort of pre-sales is I didn't have a quota. And so I could go find interesting things that I thought might pan out 3, 5, 7 years from now, or from then, and dig in on them. And Daniel was so good about giving us the freedom to do that and really look at, are you moving the needle over the course of several years? It sort of gave me the freedom and the platform to go design exactly the startup that we'd want to go build. So I look at it as a very fortunate position that I was in to be able to do that. And all I had to do was sort of pay attention.
So, yeah. And so, what's the sort of founding story behind Privacy Dynamics? How did you move from some of these insights that you were getting and the setup and the the overall data ecosystem, privacy world, that led to the founding of the company. Tell me about how you connected those dots.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it as a whole bunch of puzzle pieces that are sort of out on the table, and as you start to fit them together, it becomes more clear on your vision. So there was a bunch of things that were going on at the time. In civic tech, there was sort of the friction for collaborating between public and private sector. So I think a good example is as Uber was really taking off and starting to integrate with cities, Uber is a really good last mile service, but cities were having a tough time connecting that last mile with like their infrastructure for transit. So there was no way at the time to say, okay, can I take an Uber to the train station and then the train station downtown, and that's the best path for my commute, because there was no data sharing happening. And the reason for that was often that the private sector companies didn't trust handing data over to the public sector. They wouldn't hand data over to the city to integrate that. And at the same time, the city had a lot of political risk from anything being disclosed for data that they had. So if they disclose information, that's like political suicide for them. And so there was just a stalemate. And so initially, the thought was, okay, from a public good standpoint, data sharing is everything, and the concerns around disclosure for individuals is really what's causing that friction. So how do we solve that problem? And the first thing that we thought of was sort of a research data collaborative that happens a lot in healthcare. So a university research organization will be the host of data from a bunch of partners. And so I had it in my mind that we would be this like third-party data collaborative, and Privacy Dynamics would be the intermediary that would host the data, anonymize it, and then make it available for research or collaboration. And I literally was like pitching Lyft and the city of Seattle and Uber in the state of Washington, and like trying to do these big collaborations. And when I was at Microsoft, those conversations were easy, right? It was like, oh yeah, Microsoft, you guys can do that. And we actually built one for the Supreme Court in the state of Washington that's still running now. But the second I left Microsoft, I'd make those phone calls. Like I called Lyft. I was like, hey, we're gonna go start this third party data collaborative for mobility, and it's gonna be great. Like nobody, it went nowhere. It's like, yeah, right. We're going to send all of our data to a startup. Like, good idea. And so we had to.
We're going to let you de-anonymize it.
Yeah,
right. Yeah,
exactly.
great.
So that was a pretty good lesson that you just have to be willing to admit that you're wrong. Like, okay, that was the wrong path. Like, what's next? How do we adjust? And like, what do we do after that? This happens in multiple areas, and you hear it from VCs, you hear it from customers, you hear it from, employees and engineers that say, oh, that's technically not possible, or we can't build it that way. And as the founder and as the leader of that, it's your job to filter that correctly, right? Like some of it's really, really good and you need to listen to it. Others, it's sort of a not right now, or doesn't quite fit into the puzzle. We can't use that piece yet. But that's probably the hardest thing about being a founder is just knowing when to plug in the piece and when not to. And you're not always right when you do it.
So was this your first WFIO moment?
One of them, yeah.
I think it's your one of your more favorite acronyms from Ben Horowitz. So tell us about what that means.
So it's we're effed, it's over. Just moments that you think like, what am I doing? It was a fun idea. And even early on when I started this, there's certain people along the way that said, oh, why don't you go do it? My wife being one of them. It's like, why don't you go do that? Sure. And fortunately, like she's the smart one of the group, and with the stable job. And so she was like, yeah, you should go do that. Why not? And those people, her and several others, when they say that, it gives you the encouragement to try. And so when you have these moments of like, oh, it's over, for me, it was like, I'll just go back to working in big tech. I'll just, go find a job again, I guess. And that happened several times. Like I remember looking at Google's job board at one point and being like, I guess I could do some of these. But the biggest one was probably when we realized that data collaborative was not going to work. And I actually called one of the privacy researchers that I used to work with at Microsoft, who was at Google, and we sat down and had coffee. And she said something in that conversation and she was like, what we haven't done yet that the industry is waiting for is the ability to measure privacy. Like that hit me. That conversation, I left and I was like, that's it. We have to dig in on doing a better job measuring, like quantifying privacy risk as a sort of foundational piece for how we move forward as an industry, not just privacy dynamics, but like until we can better understand how to measure privacy, we can't execute on these vague regulations and policies that are being set.
And so that was an inspiring conversation. And how did that sort of change your thinking about the problem space and or the solution that you were going to offer?
Well, it became so then the next phase of the pitches, and mind you, I was pitching any investor I could talk to this entire time, like trying to.
That's when you started to speak.
Yeah, and I would love to go back and look at the first pitch that I gave you and see where we were. I think it was here on like the measurement stuff, and so I was very convinced, like if we can quantify privacy risk, everything else falls in line. And if you can start to layer that, and this is where the Looker stuff starts coming back, and like if you can start to layer that on the data stack that's evolving now on top of Snowflake, now it becomes a tool. Now it becomes a tool that's the basis for all the privacy transformation that you do going forward. Because one of the core thesis and the vision that I had that's still true today, and it was true at the very beginning, was that the cost of privacy is too high, and that's sort of what it boiled down to. The cost being engineering time, the cost being like not using data in ways that are valuable to the company, and then the actual costs of the compliance. And so to me, if we can do better tools and reduce that cost of privacy, mainly around the value of the data the value of anonymized data, that was the like core fundamental thesis of the company. And so to me, the IP was, how do we measure and quantify privacy risk? The challenge with that is it's category creation. Like you're going to VCs that are looking at a market. And this is before privacy was, and dev tools were really, hot at all in data infrastructure. And it was like, yeah, it seems interesting, but how many people care about that? And keep in mind, I was still under the impression that most companies wanted to be privacy perfect, right? They wanted to have this like stand up best in class privacy practice to build on trust, because that's what worked for Microsoft and Azure, was this sort of trusted initiative. And we can get into, when I finally decided that privacy perfection was not the goal.
Well, this whole, I love this conversation because it sort of reflects the process. Some of it's intuition, some of it's running a process, some of it's like committing to the process and giving yourself up to the process as a founder. And it's essentially this process of just constant iteration. And I imagine that you were probably talking to 3 groups of people through all of these iterations. One is the investors that you were probably continuing to keep open threads with. One is customers and trying to sort of, socialize this amongst a market, amongst early users. And then the third is your team. And all 3 of those groups can be challenging to manage during, such as an iterative process. I'm just curious as to how you did that and how you structured that. Did you sort of have the awareness of what was going on as you were, in the forest, or, was it really just like you're just trying to avoid trees?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's just out of necessity of don't die, like stay alive. I made a deal with my wife early that I would always keep getting paid, and so investors, and it was a like fraction of my salary that I was used to, but it was like just the bare minimum, and that was the goal. If there ever came a time where I couldn't make a paycheck, I had to start looking for a job, and she like held me to that, which actually was really important for what it drove me to do and how it drove me to think. And so it just, accountability is super important as a founder. So wherever you get it, you have to get it. But there was actually a 4th group too that was pretty important as an influencer to me. And that 4th group was academic research. So privacy research. There's this whole group of privacy researchers that I have a ton of respect for, that have really pushed the industry forward. People like Ryan Kalo at UW and Woody Hartzog and Dana Boyd, and people that have really contributed a lot to the awareness and understanding of data privacy. And so that was trying to respect their views and their opinions and all that they know about it, but building something that was useful for the enterprise so they would actually deploy it, so that, you know, the cost of privacy perfection is really, really high. But at what level will an enterprise deploy this at scale so that we can actually start to make progress towards, you know, more ethical and privacy safe data science and AI and ML, et cetera. And so balancing all of those was hard. And there were key moments along the way that going back and forth between all four of those groups was critical, and getting insight and feedback that you can trust from all four of those groups was critical to seeing how that puzzle starts to come together, right? And seeing which pieces fit and getting the boundaries set. And there was a bunch of key moments there, you know, two that really come to mind. One from a CTO at a company, the consumer company, that collects a lot of really sensitive personal, like, location information. And I thought, oh, this is a perfect early adopter for us, a design partner. Like, they need us just as much as we need them. And he said to me, look, privacy is important to us, but we really don't care about privacy. We care about the data. Like, as a business, the business is on the data. And so we're not going to build a privacy business. Like, the business is the data. We need to check the box on privacy and hit the switch, but we don't necessarily care. If you tell us that it's good enough, like, we believe you. And that was hard for me to hear, because I'd been building this whole thing on the notion that people wanted to be more privacy perfect. And so that took me a few days to really digest, but it was a super critical point in the journey of what we do in sort of setting this switch of saying, you trust us to run the transformation. You tell us what you need out of the data, and, like, we'll run the transformation to make sure that it meets the privacy requirements that you're setting. But then we'll deliver data that meets the sort of analytics standards and requirements that you have. And that moment was a scary shift. And that was the shift kind of right when you really got involved, and a few of our, Kent Goldman, our pre-seed investor, we had 3 months of runway left from him. And I told him we were making this big shift to the data engineering side and sort of doing no code for on the privacy side. And he was like, "Are you sure?" And bless him, he's been a really good investor for us, that he again holds me accountable and, like, is honest. But at the same time, when I shared that conviction of that was the path, he said, "Okay, like, go for it."
That's great.
Yeah.
And so then you're balancing the customer feedback you're getting, you're sort of iterating on ideas. What was the nature of the product that finally came out of this process? So basically, tell us about the Privacy Dynamics product now, and who it's for and what it looks like.
Yeah. So, and this was came out of another one of those discussions from those four stakeholders was, so I'd attended through the Looker team. Keenan and Ben Porterfield were early investors, and so I stayed pretty close to them, and went to the Fivetran user conference with them and met Taylor Brown. This was pretty early Fivetran, and I was talking to Taylor, and he's like, "Oh yeah, all of our customers struggle with this." And so that was my first sort of introduction into Fivetran. And then, fast forward 18 months or 2 years, even after that conversation, 18 months, they did a fireside chat with Scott Breitnother from Brooklyn Data Company. So I think it was Scott and Taylor and Tristan Handy from DPT. And this conversation around privacy sort of came up in one of them. And so I thought, wow, I should really reach out to this crew, because, like, they're seeing all the same issues that we believe. And so I literally cold emailed Scott afterwards and just said, "Hey, I really enjoyed the talk. Like, I would love to share what we do." And he responded right away. And it was a great lesson for me that people in this space and in the data infrastructure space especially, they care so much about moving the industry forward, and they're just great people. Like they want to help, they want to get involved, and so that kicked off a really good partnership with them, and they've just been a wonderful design partner all through the entire process. But that led us down this path of like really getting to know data engineers and what they care about. And so now the product is tries to stay out of the way as much as possible, fits in really seamlessly on top of like the Snowflake dbt workflow, where you sort of transforming data and getting it into a stable state in a schema in Snowflake. And then if you want to clean it, you literally just turn on our switch and you say, here are the parameters of what I'm looking for in the data, run it and create this clean table and dump it into a schema that I can use. And taking out all of the manual process that historically has been the way that privacy transformations are done, to understand, how do I need to treat each record in this data set to make sure that it's not identifiable, and what adjustments do I need to make? Like we can take care of all of that on our end. So that's really where the product ended up.
Got it. And would you say that the current product is more in line with the lowering the cost of privacy, or it's more in the line of measuring the measurement aspect of the privacy, or both? Like how are those two things sort of being traded off, or are they being traded off in your existing product?
Yeah, they're totally dependent on one another. And so in order to lower the cost of privacy, you have to be more precise with what you're doing to your data. So in the case where there's a common approach is like column-wise treatment to data. So if you have there's direct identifiers like name and phone number and social security number that they're direct identifiers that you need to redact or mask or tokenize. But then on the indirect identifiers, these are the ones that are a little bit harder to understand and see, but they're the ones that you can attribute back and re-identify an individual. So that's sort of the breach risk.
And these are the things where you could, just to be clear, where you could sort of mash together a couple data sets and de-anonymize it through some of these indirect qualifiers that might not be necessarily obvious as PII.
Exactly. The easiest one to articulate to the audience is just if you have age, gender, and zip code, for instance. If the age, for example, is very high, like say the age is 110 years old and the zip code is Jackson Hole in a small area of Jackson Hole, most people are going to know who that person is, right? There's only going to be 110-year-old person in that area. And so if you have any sort of background knowledge of that domain or that data set, you're going to be able to identify that person. If that has health data associated with it, like cancer data, you would then be able to attribute that person has cancer, and that's a violation of HIPAA. So those are the things that are a little bit harder to find in these huge data sets that we're creating now, especially in health tech, and all of us have these unique digital fingerprints, and so for us, layering on top of where that data is sitting in a data warehouse and before it's being used downstream, just being able to have that checked and say, hey, is anything in this data set standing out that could be at risk for that individual? And do we need to do a minor tweak? Do we need to adjust that age from 110 down to 103? Because now we have 203-year-olds. And just that grouping or that coupling allows you to determine that the data set's been de-identified. So that's largely based on k-anonymity, which HIPAA and for those that don't know HIPAA can go through either safe harbor, where you like strip out certain types of data, or expert determination, where you've kind of determined that there's a very small risk of data being identified. And to do that, it was largely based on k-anonymity, and now there's some variations of that happening now that are a little bit more accurate. But we've kind of coupled together a few of these techniques to ensure that data, no single record is standing alone, and it always sort of has a partner to offer that anonymity.
And so the focus of the current project, the current tool set, is to enable data engineers to sort of operate in a privacy safe way, with as little friction as possible. And I mean, just hearing you talk about it, I think you have the capacity to make something that generally sounds painful and tedious and unsexy, for engineers, sexy again, or at least palatable. That's it seems like, as I've seen you develop the product vision over time, like that's been something that you've been able to do. Do you have any comments on that in regards to how engineers are approaching your tooling now, and what the responses are?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we'll ever be successful making privacy sexy. It's and that's
Privacy
okay.
sexy again.
Yeah. I think efficiency is sexy, and like if you can take operational task stuff off an engineer's plate, like data engineers are being asked to do so much now at organizations. And now the sort of evolution of the analytics engineer role, and they're being asked to do a lot at organizations. But ultimately, they all have to work together on raw data is landing in a data warehouse. We have to sort of clean that up and get it ready to provide, good quality data downstream to whether it's a BI team or a ML, engineering team, or publishing the data to partners. You have to do a lot of work to prepare that data. And one of those steps is often anonymizing it, or ensuring that you're not going to disclose something sensitive. And so that step, if you ask a data engineer to verify or treat a data set to be anonymized, like they're very rarely do they have any privacy experience or training. And so we've said, okay, how do we support the work that they have to do, and designing and developing that data product the way that they want it? And we take care of the privacy side. We say, okay, we understand how you want the data to look. Now let us run those minor adjustments that we need to eliminate that risk that someone could be singled out. And so by balancing that, and our engineering team just did a phenomenal job kind of taking the I don't even want to say no code right now, because so many engineers give me a hard time for it, but it really is like looking at the privacy transformation side. It's no code for privacy transformation, but on the like analytics configuration side, like you get all the controls for that. And so to me, and what the data engineers have been so positively responsive over is, okay, you made our job a lot easier to go through this step that, again, we don't care about. We know we need to check the box on it, and ethically it's important to us, but we don't care about going into the nitty gritty on how to treat each record. We actually care more about getting this data set published so we can go on to the next task and the next job that we have to do.
Yeah, well, we've talked about this before. I mean, I personally love the strategy because you figure out a way inside the existing tool chain to integrate a privacy tool in an effective way. And as long as you maintain that spot in the workflow, and engineers sort of agree with you by using your product, then you, Privacy Dynamics, get to sort of change or update or innovate on the algos behind that spot in the tool chain, and sort of use best of breed research, or change your anonymization techniques, or build that out to be a very robust thing over time. And that's sort of regardless of, it's because of your place in the tooling, in the tool chain, but that's sort of all like abstracted away for the engineers who are just basically committing to use your tool because you're the best thing that they can find when it comes to fulfilling privacy obligations in their data engineering workflows.
Yeah, and we really wanted to focus on that top to bottom in the business of the way it's designed and built, but also the way it's turned on. And so fortunately, the enterprise security and privacy tooling stack is moving more towards bottom up, like product-led growth type strategies. And the way that software is being procured at organizations is changing, which is really helpful to us. Because one of the big trends that's shifting now, especially in privacy and compliance, is we've had the maturity of the compliance tool platforms, right? So first it was OneTrust, and now Big ID, and these big companies that have expansive platforms to manage all of your privacy across the stack. And those are really good for big enterprise, but they're often way too much for small and mid-sized businesses that have, teams of 5 and 10 engineers. And so that really just aren't concerned about doing all those tasks yet. And so for us, going in and saying, here's a tool that you can turn on and start using in 5 minutes. Like, you can literally go on our site and like turn it on and start using it within minutes, and can just connect it to your warehouse. And that was important for us, because if the persona that we designed that around was a data engineer is asked to anonymize a data set, they literally go search like how to anonymize the data set. And then they're writing like, their own SQL and trying to figure out, how to do that. Where instead, if they can just point it to our tool and get a clean data set in return, it's going to be a lot more reliable, a lot more consistent, and actually meet the requirements that the compliance or privacy teams or even regulators would want to see, and improve that workflow for them. And now, instead of a compliance team at a certain size company, instead of a compliance team pushing down a platform on an engineer and saying you have to pull data through this process and being restrictive, now the engineers can go up and say, oh no, I followed that policy by using this tool. Like, aren't you proud of me? And what we found from compliance leaders and privacy leaders is they were so relieved that they didn't have to go push tools down to engineering anymore, and that actually engineers have the tooling to sort of follow protocols and work up the chain. So that's been a really big relief for us, to see that as we can grow our footprint within an organization and have more engineers using the tool, we actually get support from the compliance and privacy teams.
Yeah, that's great. So then what's the process for creating a policy in privacy dynamics? Like, who do you see? It must be collaboration amongst different stakeholders and different teams to basically configure the tool to sort of generate the level of privacy that's expected at that particular organization. What does that process typically look like?
Yeah, so this is where contextually every data set's different, every use case is different, and to design around that was really hard, right? Like, we can't automate and guess what, if you're releasing a data set, like, I don't know who you're releasing it to, I don't know what's in the data. And so to provide a tool that supports that was a big challenge. And what we landed on, and what our engineering and our data science team did together that was so special, was essentially creating a dial. And if you look at K anonymity is the simplest metric to talk about. It's like K2 is a group of 2 or more, and K5 is a group of 5 or more. So you're just adjusting the group size, and then the likelihood that someone could be re-identified. And its simplest terms would be like 1 out of 2, 1 out of 5, 1 out of 10. And then you can do sampling and kind of provide an estimate that way. But for a user, they can quickly understand like K2 is a little less protected than K10, but the granularity of the data is gonna be higher. It's like, okay, I can just play with this dial and I can see, so quickly on the report, you'll see like what changes in the data and how the shape of the data and the analytics of the data change, whether it's you care about correlation between 2 fields or sort of the mean median stats. But as you're adjusting that dial and you're treating the data more or less, you can say, okay, here's what we need out of the data. Here's how accurate we need the data to be for our ML training, maybe. And now I know what the privacy sort of threshold is that this data meets. And now downstream, I can say, okay, this data is not suitable for publishing online, and we need some policies and parameters around that for how to use it and what not to do with it. But at least that transparency is there about how the data is risky, if at all. So that was one big step. And then if policy is being pushed down for data publishing, for instance, a company might have a policy to say, HIPAA is a good example, like K2 is suitable for HIPAA and healthcare research. So if you need to publish at K2, you set it at K2, and our tool ensures that the data set comes out at K2 and no more. There's actually a big utility loss if you start going above that. If you over anonymize data, that's when it gets really bad, and the perception of anonymized data gets really poor. As if you're just over anonymizing it, it becomes sort of useless and very vanilla or lacks insights.
When you mentioned sort of the statistical notion of or the process of cleaning up or tokenizing or anonymizing some of this data, it strikes me that that's sort of adjacent to like a data quality discussion. Do you use anything like Great Expectations behind the scenes to help sort of deliver this, make this process work?
Yeah, so Great Expectations is pretty close through the root portfolio, and I think yours.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's been a discussion. I think, as you know, we just launched the public beta of it today, and that's been a discussion, because if we can integrate and support tools like Great Expectations, you could see a scenario where you have a data pipeline running, and we orchestrate in that same flow. You could set something like, maintain a privacy threshold of X, and if it falls below that, run privacy dynamics again to treat it. And so there's a lot of sort of alignment between all of these tools, and as teams build their stacks, that's one thing that we want to encourage, and why I think the data infrastructure group is so good at collaborating together, is because they see the benefits for customers of coupling these tools together. DBT has been a great connector for all of these groups too.
Yeah, very cool. Well, it's neat when you start to sort of what's the right word? I don't know if atomize is the right word, but when you start to sort of create clear separations of concerns, and you come up with the right abstractions in the way you think about data engineering tooling and sort of what needs to be built where, I think these adjacencies and the beauty of the way the whole ecosystem fits together starts to become more clear. But it's literally from founders, like you or like Abe or whoever, who are insisting on trying to be as tight in their thinking about the proper types and nature of the abstractions as possible. And it's really amazing once you start to see a whole team or a whole community of folks, work on those challenges in a clear-headed way.
Yeah, and I think it's important to stay focused on, like, I know our value add is in transformation. Like, just if we can run the privacy transformations now, and I'm not trying to add product to grow revenue across all these different areas where I suddenly feel like everyone's a competitor. If we just stay focused on contributing the core value of our products and sort of relying on everyone else to do the same in their lanes, now you can start to see really good experiences form for the industry. And so if I can collaborate with partners that do, like Big ID, for instance, is a perfect example. They do a really good job with all of the privacy and compliance tasks that are downstream from us. Yeah. And investors asked really early, like, oh, when are you going to get into compliance? There's more money in compliance. And it's like, why would we get into compliance? There's already companies doing a really good job with that. So if we can feed information about privacy risks and data sets to a Big ID, now they can do a better job sort of doing the data mapping and doing all of those tasks that they do so well with. And now we're just feeding their ecosystem. If we can build our business model around that, and ours is all around, it's just like Fivetran, it's around consumption, it makes all of that possible, and all those channels become more valuable. And so I'm a big fan of partnering versus trying to eat away at revenue in other areas.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm really excited to hear about your public beta. Tell us about the kinds of use cases that your design partners or your early customers that you've been working with the closer group. Like, how has that been going, and what are folks using the tool for?
Yeah, so there's sort of three main use cases that we're seeing bubble up the most, and I'm learning new ones all the time too. So please don't feel like I'm omitting you if you hear this and you have a use case. I'd love to hear it. But there's sort of three main themes that it falls around. The first and the most obvious is data publishing. So anytime data is being published out of the company, you want to ensure that you can't control what it's being joined with later. You'd want to make sure that it's pretty locked down in terms of the likelihood that you could have this sort of relinking attack that got Netflix and IMDb. And so I don't know if people are familiar with the Netflix breach. It was they had a contest that they released a data set of movie watching, and someone joined it with an IMDb data set and was able to map back the profile from IMDb to the Netflix account. And so those publishing risks, you can't control external knowledge, or like what information, background knowledge that someone has on the data subjects. And so you really want to probably anonymize that more. So that's use case one. This happens a lot in healthcare, like pharmaceutical research. Those data sets are published under HIPAA and expert determination. So we do some of that. And then really in the growth of health tech and all these health tech companies using PHI and health information and data sets for really interesting personalized services and innovative things on the health tech side, the data teams that are using that information have concerns around, is this data safe under HIPAA policies and procedures? And so running it through our, like as they're pulling it out of their data warehouse and running it through our tool for training and early dev and test, it's a really good way to do that. And even in production, if you're running a production model off of it, that's when we get into these like great expectations conversations about setting up a pipeline that maintains that that threshold. So that's one. That's a pretty exciting one. Two is just internal analytics and BI. And so if you have all of your customer data and you're trying to figure out things like churn or what's causing customers to increase consumption of your product, you don't necessarily want to provide all of that detailed customer information to every team across the company that would be garnering these insights. And so giving them access to schemas that have been cleaned or had these sort of micro transformations to make sure it's privacy safe, now you can really reduce the exposure that you have from a security perspective on who has access to that customer data. And that can continue to power really strong analytics and BI. And then the third one is that's growing, and actually Lee Marie Braswell wrote about this not too long ago in their Founders Fund post, and really articulated it nicely if you want to read more about it on her blog. But the ML training data. So ML training data, there's a few different options for it now. Like a lot of people are using synthetic data and building sort of models and training neural nets to do that. Another option is just this transformation of raw data and making sure that you dump that into a schema that can power the ML training. So it's a little bit more of a kind of hybrid synthetic approach where some of the data has been adjusted or you could consider it synthetic, but a large percentage of the data still remains the original set. And so you can maintain a lot of the messiness of original data because often those trained models are very smooth. They're very like sort of, they don't represent real world data very well. And so sometimes you want that in your models.
Got it. And from a product roadmap standpoint, like what are you most excited about in terms of the privacy dynamics roadmap?
Yeah, so one of what we launched today is the SaaS public beta, and so you can go on the site and start playing around with it. There's sample data. You can connect to a Snowflake data warehouse and start to play with data that you have. But we know that at a certain point, an organization and even smaller teams don't necessarily want to send sensitive data to a service and get it back. And so on the roadmap that we have privately available now, and it'll be publicly available soon, is deployment through replicated and a Kubernetes instance. So you can start to run it in your local AWS environment or Azure environment and run it as a dedicated service on-prem. So now data doesn't have to come to us and go back. So this is where a lot of the healthcare companies are ending up, is running that on-prem. So you just get into a lot simpler policies and procedures and agreements if that data doesn't actually leave their domain.
We have a question coming in from YouTube. Someone is asking about attribute access applying for that policy. I assume that means sort of how does a policy get triggered in the system?
Like maybe like attribute-based access controls and stuff?
Yeah, perhaps.
Yeah.
Let's see
Maybe.
if we can get any additional clarification.
I'm happy to follow up on it, but what I would assume that question is around is, can you set access controls based on like privacy scores, for instance, or like privacy numbers. And so one of the areas that I'm excited about, and one of the products actually that DBT launched is our metadata product that allows you to write back information into the metadata and the DBT project. And so one of those areas that we're looking at is like the privacy score for that data set. So pre-treatment, post-treatment, either one, but maybe both. And now you can start to set access controls based on that data.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be an area that we could explore. But we look at this a lot as our job, as you get really narrow, is to sort of measure and treat the data and allow you to set a target and meet that target for privacy risk, and then make that data available to users to set whatever controls for access that they want downstream. So we'll be very open with making that data available. We are pretty open about making that data available for those reasons.
Got it. Well, Graham, this has been a great chat. It's always great to talk to you, and super glad that you made the time for us. I just wanted to ask you a parting question before we let you go.
Yeah.
What surprised you most about your work in the data ecosystem so far?
I honestly, it's the people and how amazing the people have been. I mentioned it earlier too, but everyone is so passionate about improving the products and basically enabling companies to do their best work by giving them a better data stack. And I've always had this theory that engineers are committed to making the world a better place. Like that's literally what makes them wake up in the morning. And there's no place I've seen it more than the data space. So
yeah, it's exciting to be part of that and to have you part of that. And thank you for your contributions.
Thank you for all your support.
Yeah, happy to. So I'm hoping folks will check out the Privacy Dynamics tool. That's privacydynamics.io. Where can they get a hold of you if they have additional questions or want to get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And any questions you have, I'm happy to chat anytime. Product questions, founder questions, getting started questions. One thing Pete and I talk about all the time is this is not some big bang. Had this brilliant idea and I was born to be a founder. Like it's literally a process that you go through to start a business. So I always love talking about that stuff too. But if you want to get a hold of me, email Graham at privacydynamics.io is a good spot, or Twitter, just at Graham Thompson, and yeah, or LinkedIn, whatever you prefer.
Great.
I'm on all of them. So
well, thanks for your contributions to the community, and I'm sure folks will be reaching out.
Absolutely. Thanks, Pete. It was a lot of
fun. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. We'll be taking a short break over the Christmas holidays, the year-end holidays. So you'll see us back in January. Don't forget that Data Council Austin is our first IRL event post-pandemic, coming up January 27th and 28th of 2022 in Austin, Texas. You can get more information at datacouncil.ai and get your early bird tickets there. Graham will be there amongst many other amazing dozens of founders, open source leaders, data experts, speakers. It's going to be an amazing time. So we're hoping that you'll join us there. So until then, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see